Hello, everybody. My name is Karen Percy, and I'm the Media President of the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance. I'm coming to you from Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung land, that's on the Wiradjuri land of the Kulin Nation in Narm's West. First Nations peoples understand these lands and this country in a very deep way, given their custodianship over tens of thousands of years. They understand the rivers, the seas, the land and the mountains, and in particular, that's the Maribyrnong River near me. I thank our Indigenous leaders for their dedication to country. I pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and any of those who may be on our webinar today. So welcome to this webinar on climate reporting, every Journo's round. Today, the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance is hosting this important event alongside the Climate Council, Australia's leading climate change communications organisation, which was started by scientists and members of the community in 2013. MEA is, of course, the union for the arts and creative sector in Australia, and our media section represents more than 5,000 journalists and media workers. Now, please note that we are recording this webinar. And I'm honoured to be moderating this event. We've got some really terrific speakers and they really know their stuff. Professor Lesley Hughes is a founder of the Climate Council and a professor at Macquarie University. Miki Perkins is the climate and environment reporter at The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. And Josh Gilbert is a Worimi Man, a farmer and an experienced communicator on climate issues. Now, as the title of the webinar says, climate reporting is now relevant to every journo. Pretty much every round these days is impacted by climate change, and most reporters will have to understand and incorporate climate reporting in their work. So it's not just environment reporters or political reporters or science reporters, it's general reporters, perhaps dealing with natural disasters or price rises because of weather events, business reporters, health reporters. Just about every journalist will need to have an understanding of the science and the social impacts of climate change. It's important that we report accurately and ask the right questions. So the aim for this evening is to inform you about climate science, to alert you to some of the common pitfalls and mistakes, to assist you with identifying reliable sources, and to ensure as journalists we're striking the right balance between the reality of climate change and not being alarmist. We want people to know and understand what's going on. But as well, we want to be able to deal with the victims of climate disasters in an ethical and sensitive way. So we have opened this forum to our colleagues in Pacific countries, as we are also aiming to ensure we all have a better understanding of the issue that affects not just us, but our neighbours as well. And this is the start of a bigger project for MEA and the Climate Council. We are planning a second webinar, which will deal specifically with disinformation and misinformation. And we're also hoping to put together some reporting guidelines to assist reporters. So thank you all for taking this important first step with us and being at tonight's webinar. So firstly, we're going to hear from each of our speakers. They've got 5 minutes each to give you their perspectives on climate reporting. Then I have some prepared questions, and then we're going to hand it over to you, the audience, in the latter half of the webinar. So please let us know in the chat that you want to ask a question and we'll come to you. If we're overwhelmed by questions, we might need to go to a different way, but hopefully we'll get you to actually come on camera and ask the questions that you want to. So firstly, let's get underway. We are going to hear now from Professor Lesley Hughes. Lesley is a founder of the Climate Council, and she's been the lead author of 2 assessment reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, the Ipcc is a body of the United Nations which assesses the science related to climate change. Lesley is a professor of biology at Macquarie University, where her research has mainly focused on the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems. Thank you, Lesley. Your 5 minutes begins now.
Thanks very much, Karen, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for asking me along today. I guess my first and most important message is don't be afraid to report on climate change. In fact, I think it's every journalist's responsibility to report on climate change because climate change, in my view and the view of many millions of people around the world, is the single most important threat to human existence and to the existence of all life on Earth. Having said that, climate change science can be really, really overwhelming. It overwhelms me. Why shouldn't it overwhelm everybody else? So one of the things I would like to say is that there are good sources of clear information. If you're really into it, as Karen said, there's the Ipcc reports. The sixth assessment report, which is the latest one, is in 3 parts, the first of which came out last August and the other 2 in March. And each one of those reports, which are about 1 million words, so they're pretty overwhelming, nonetheless has a very good executive summary at the beginning. So for general climate information, that's a great source. The other great source, of course, and of course I'm biased, is the Climate Council and the Associated Climate Media Centre. And at any time, if you want to check the facts, find out more information, then the Climate Council is absolutely there to help you. That is their role, and we are all more than happy to assist you in any way. As Karen said, climate change is not just an environmental issue, and it shouldn't be reported only as an environmental issue. It's an issue that affects all sectors, be it agriculture, health, tourism, social cohesion, our economy, our security, absolutely everything. So there are plenty of opportunities to report on climate change. It's generally considered that Australia is one of the most vulnerable countries, certainly the most vulnerable developed country to the impacts of climate change. And we are seeing those impacts all the time. The Black Summer bushfires and the recent flooding on the East Coast being 2 examples. But it's not just that. Climate change is now affecting all our weather. Our atmosphere is warmer, it's holding more water. Basically, all of our weather is being affected by human activities via climate change. So it's not a matter of saying, is this event climate change or not? That's actually the wrong question. All our weather is being affected by climate change, which is not to say on occasion we don't get some really cold days, because certainly we've been experiencing those recently. It's important to realise the difference between climate and weather. So weather's what you experience on a daily basis. It determines whether you take an umbrella to work or not. Whereas climate's generally in the past been thought of as weather trends over 30 or so years. I have to say that with the climate now changing so quickly, that we are detecting those human activity signals in climate over much shorter time periods than that. And we're frequently seeing the word unprecedented, referring to extreme weather events. And every time you see the word unprecedented, every time you see records being broken, that really is the result of human activities on the climate. I want to say something very quickly about the word attribution. I know journalists think of the word attribution as referring to where you get your information, where you credit your sources. Attribution has a specific meaning in science as well. It's when we give an actual percentage to say, well, this climate event has been made 150%, for example, worse by human activities affecting the climate. And those are called attribution studies. So I wanted to clear that up. Attribution studies are often done sometime after an event, but that shouldn't stop anybody reporting on things like the East Coast floods recently as being influenced by climate change. Some climate change skeptics and deniers will say, and some politicians, now is not the time to refer to climate change and report on climate change. My response to that is, now is exactly the time to report on climate change, because it is when we're seeing the impacts of climate change affecting real people, real communities, real aspects of the environment. So I guess to sum up, don't be afraid of reporting on climate change. It is the most important issue facing us. It is absolutely the responsibility of all of us to address it, and absolutely journalists are an enormously important part of getting the right message out to the community. So just a few things. I'll pass you back to Karen, but really happy to participate in the discussion later. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you so much, Lesley. Lots of really interesting and thought-provoking information there that really is important to the discussion. We're now going to hear from Miki Perkins, an award-winning journalist for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, who is the climate and environment reporter. And needless to say, she's been having a very busy time of late. 5 minutes starts now for you, Miki, and I will give you a time call at about 4.5 minutes. Off you go.
Thanks, Karen. I've actually got some notes. So if you see my eyes sliding to the right, it's just because I'm making sure I haven't forgotten anything. There's lots to get through. As a reporter, I thought the best thing for me to do would be to talk about what the barriers are when you start reporting on climate and what's confusing for people sometimes. The main things I thought about were that the science of emissions and climate can be confusing. You can also feel like a constant purveyor of bad news that nobody wants to read. It can be difficult to know how to report on such a big and overwhelming global issue, and also difficult to know what sources you can trust. So just to quickly go through those, obviously Lesley mentioned it before, but the IPCC, is the place to go, in my view, for accurate, rigorous climate information. It's free, it's accessible, the executive summaries are a lifesaver, and it's global, but it does have some details about specific countries. If you're looking for Australian specific stuff, I would highly recommend having a look at the State of the Environment report that came out probably a couple of weeks ago now. Very thorough, covers the last 5 years and how we know the environment has been changing in Australia. And also, you've got sources like the Bureau of Meteorology and the CSIRO and academic institutions like universities. So there are literally hundreds of climate scientists in Australia, and many of them want to speak to journalists because they want to share the information that they're getting. So if you say to them that you're new, that you're a bit unsure what you're doing, you're not sure about the emissions science or anything really, they're always very helpful and keen to help in my experience. The second thing is obviously the idea of that you're always reporting bad news. It's a tricky one in climate because there is a lot of bad news in climate and it's not getting any better at the moment. But I would always recommend that if you're reporting in this area, you try and leaven your output, lighten your output from time to time with the small wins, because there are wins happening all the time, whether it's being, a species that's had a breeding success, or like we saw today, I don't know whether you regard it as a win or not, but some people would, the climate legislation passing federally, communities coming together to organise around renewables. There's always something you can find that's good for the readers and it's good for you as well, because journalists suffer from burnout, they suffer from eco-anxiety like anybody does, and climate change is not a light or easy round, and that needs to be acknowledged. So it's terrifying, but it's also very exciting, because through your work, you can play your own small part in trying to put the best information out there for your readers or your viewers, so people can make informed decisions about who they vote for, the actions that they might take, even where they spend their capital. And that's really important. That really matters. Most of you are not going to be a pure climate or environment reporter. You've probably come into it from a different reporting area. So think about, how you can put that one line of context, that one bit of background into your piece that puts whatever you're doing in that wider context and puts climate back in the frame. It's such a global issue and it's such a complex issue that sometimes that can be very overwhelming to know where to start. So I would just say, where you can, always try and localise climate change. Unfortunately, in Australia, we are, experiencing climate change in many different ways. So there's always a local story that you can find to try and illustrate things like sea level rise or higher precipitation or flooding or whatever, unfortunately. And, really think about breaking the information down for the audience. So using assets like graphs and images, video, anything that provides some sort of clarity to this, very overwhelming topic that, to be honest, a lot of people just want to turn away from. They want to turn away from it because it's overwhelming and it's really scary, and we understand that. So you need to make it accessible for them, some sort of hook that draws them into the story. I think those are the main points. Now, I've got some tips at the end, but we're going to come back to that at the end. So I might go back to Karen now and Josh, and then perhaps we can talk about tips at the very end of the session. Yeah, thanks.
Hey. Thank you so much, Miki. Brilliant practical advice there, because it can feel a bit overwhelming, and sometimes just taking that first step is kind of the most important, is just acknowledging what you don't know. And of course, never any dumb questions. It's now my pleasure to introduce Joshua Gilbert, a Worimi Man from the New South Wales Central Coast. He wears a number of different hats: entrepreneur, business advisor, and he specialises in Aboriginal culture as well as agriculture and the environment. So, Josh, your time begins now, and I can give you a 4.5 minute nudge if you would like.
Thanks, Karen. I have a stopwatch here because I'm renowned for having a big yarn. So at any time, feel free to stop me. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'm actually on Gadigal country down here in Sydney of the Eora Nation. I just want to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that to all the lands that you're joining from today, and shout out to all the mob on the call. And also acknowledge the role that all of you have as journalists in not only reporting environmental issues, but also Indigenous affairs issues, because there's so much context and opportunity that needs to be shared in that space, and particularly in the broader environmental movement. I'm a Worimi farmer. My mob have been on the land on Worimi country on the mid-north coast of New South Wales for the last 65,000 years. Our recorded history go back to the first recorded births in the caves in the mountains of where I live in Gloucester today. And my story in terms of why agriculture started almost 200 years ago when our land was handed to the Australian Agricultural Company. And we've been watching and monitoring the impacts of climate change and human-induced changes since then. I try and tell the story in terms of the impacts that we see because of climate change on our farm and what we see on our landscape and that broader Worimi context that we see it within. Just in the last 3 or 4 years, we've experienced some of the worst drought that my grandparents and great-grandparents can recall. We've seen the impacts of bushfires surrounding our property, and have had to prepare our property for that. Obviously, COVID has impacted our community, and on top of all that, we've just had a spate of floods that have crushed our boundary fences, meaning that we've had to do quite a lot of remediation on those, repairing them to beyond means that we've ever seen before, and that my grandfather, who still lives next door to our property, can remember. So these are the long-term ongoing effects, and unfortunately they're becoming more and more frequent. We're seeing the impacts of these large climate events, almost you could set your watch to it. It's becoming that predictable that we're seeing them over and over again. We just don't know what form they're taking. Really, our role and the role I see us as farmers and environmentalists playing in this conversation is to take the climate scientists, vast knowledge of the scientific knowledge, and really want to acknowledge Lesley and the work that the Climate Council have done in this space to prepare farmers to share our stories and what we're seeing on our landscape. We also know that it can also be a time of damning news that we see these really large atrocities in our natural environment, and that obviously has a really drastic impact on not only people but the land and our natural environment. And our role, I guess, as storytellers throughout that is to weave all the contextualization, all those bits together, and tell the narrative around not only just this one event, but the spate of events that we've been experiencing. I also think it's important to bring an Indigenous lens to this. And as I said, my family have been here for the last, or Worimi country for the last 65,000+ years. And I see this as a really, I look at this in terms of optimism. I want, and my goal in life is to make sure that my family, my mob, can continue farming our landscape for the next 65,000 years. And the only way that's possible is by listening to climate scientists, sharing knowledges between some of the pivotal information that we have now around what the state of the environment is, combining that with strong Indigenous knowledges and understanding of landscape to get the best outcomes for us all to survive and thrive on country. And for me, obviously, on Worimi country, that's the connection piece. I know it's really easy to get into, as Miki mentioned, those terrible events that are happening and those bad news stories. But for me, it's a continued sign for optimism. I know that we will probably lose aspects of our farm because of sea level rise, being a feeder into the ocean. I know that not all of our landscape will stay pristine, but what I know is that the knowledges that our old people have, that our young people have also had to adopt and transfer into this modern world, is all the bits of content, all the bits of information, and all the understanding that we need to connect our knowledges to the next 65,000 years. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that journey with you. It's really a passion project for me. And it really is that long-term view in which I hope to share. I know it's hard for audiences to always share that with, but if we can start thinking in terms of generations, that's where I think we'll start getting change. So thanks to Mia and to the Climate Council for the opportunity. I'm happy to pin any questions now, as well as we move into the next stage, but also available for any yarns into the future. You can come up to the farm, you can come and see what we're doing, but really it's the opportunity to showcase that this is an optimistic lens as well, not just the doom and gloom of what's happening in our environment. So thank you.
Thanks, Josh. That's a brilliant perspective. I'm going to get each of you, I think, to answer this particular question. Miki made reference to the fact that the legislation for emissions reduction has changed. I would like to know from each of you, and I'll get Lesley to start perhaps, is how would you like to see things reported now? Because it seems that we have had a shift in our politics and in our attitudes. How would you like things to be reported from now on, given that there's agreement on this? Lesley.
In two things, really. Firstly, to say, well, good on Labor for actually making some legislation with a better target, but also the target isn't enough, as the Greens and the Teals have been pointing out, so keep the pressure on. So, you know, part congratulations for getting us this far and to openly be talking about trying to end the climate wars, but don't let them off the hook, because that target isn't enough. We know from the science that for Australia to do its bit for the Paris Climate Agreement, we need to have, you know, something pretty close to 75% reduction by 2030, because from the science, we know that it's what we do between now and 2030 that will determine whether our kids have a safe future or not. So absolutely say, yep, it's a good start, but it's not a good finish. Keep up the pressure.
Miki, accountability, holding power to account is so integral to what we do as journalists. How would you like to see things go forward differently?
I think the thing I really noticed with reporting is that journalists are very easily distracted and derailed by whatever the political parties of the day want to throw up. So, for example, today there was obviously the very important passing of this, or, you know, agreement to pass the legislation by the Greens, but there was also the coalition suddenly wanted to talk about nuclear. Now, I think, you know, if you're thinking about climate reporting, what you really need to do is to focus on the long game. You don't want to get distracted by stuff which is maybe being used for political point scoring. Nuclear as an energy production option is expensive and unrealistic. That's been proven time and time again. So as a reporter, you need to think about where you focus your energy. Do you focus it on getting pulled sideways onto discussions about nuclear or other sort of distractions? Or do you focus on, okay, so where to from now? You've thought about the 43% reduction target. How does that get achieved? What are the industries that need to be built? Do we have the legislation to support them? Which oil and gas projects are lining up for approval? Are they likely to get funding or financing? You know, sort of those bigger picture stories rather than, I guess, getting caught up in the news of the day. That's what I'd really like to see more of.
Josh, there's a real difference and a real shift, I think, in our First Nations narrative too, particularly given what's happened over the weekend. When it comes to this kind of meeting of Indigenous interests and climate, which you are right in the thick of it, how would you like to see things differently, or reported differently?
I think for me, what I'm hoping the media really does is provide more opportunity for us to showcase the change and allow us to be part of the narrative. I think the constant fear for me is that we have governments go by, we have government policy that might not reflect exactly what we need. But we on the front lines continuously need to create change and to make sure that our voices and our thoughts and our knowledges are heard. I often wonder, you know, if we had a library that tried to capture all the Indigenous knowledge over the last 65,000 years, you know, would we take it seriously then if it was a written history rather than oral history? And we know that the stories that our mob tell really paint the picture of the landscape and the changes we've seen since then. So for me, it's as much about getting your hands dirty and getting down in the dirt and listening and I think that the big is that I see the opportunity to be is not, I want black fellas to be standing up and sharing of voice around climate issues, ag policy, finance policy, know the landscape so well, where Indigenous people and our interests still span over, 57% of Australia's landmass still today under, Western legislation and laws. We still have that connection over all lands, and we still hold those ties very dearly. So for me, why would you not go to a library and listen and learn from the biggest knowledge source probably in the world, and use those principles and that understanding to really inform not only government policy, but the way in which you communicate and share with audiences right across Australia and the world about.
Lesley, I want to pick up what you were talking about, Australia's vulnerability to climate change, particularly our vulnerability, being higher as a Western developed nation. How much has the climate, the culture wars on climate change and our reporting thereof responsible or partly to blame for Australia's vulnerability? How much is that a contributing factor?
Look, I think the contributing factors are both physical and political. Physically, Australia has a naturally highly variable climate and a largely dry climate. So that, gives us a baseline vulnerability for any more extreme events. But certainly the last 10 years of wasted time and wasted delay is viewed elsewhere in the world, especially in places like Europe, with just amazement. People just shake their heads and say, well, what are you doing down there? This is absolutely crazy. You are suffering now. Why do you approach this issue ideologically rather than look at the facts? So yes, look, I think Australia is most vulnerable because of its natural physical aspects, but the fact that we've had this ideological war for so long basically puts us behind the 8 ball, which is why we need to do the 75% reduction. But it is also meant that we haven't been planning for coping with these events in the future. So there was a Productivity Commission report a few years ago that said that 97% of all resources around disasters are spent mopping up afterwards, and only 3% are spent, preparing. If we hadn't had this 10-year ideological war, I think we'd be in also a much better position to be adapting. So absolutely, at least partly responsible. Yes.
Miki, there are time pressures on journalists, resourcing issues, far fewer journalists than there used to be, 24/7, lots of different pressures. And journalists are often having to cut corners. What advice would you have to ensure that reporters can make their reporting meaningful given these kinds of restraints? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. I think the first point really is that there doesn't need to be, it depends on the story, obviously, but you don't need to have a huge amount of information in there about climate. It doesn't need to be paragraphs and paragraphs of a broader story. It could just be simply that you make reference to something or you put something in some kind of context. You have 2 or 3 sentences in the story, which won't require a huge amount of extra research for you, but just reminds everybody that a weather story is occurring within a greater climate context. A health story about, heat waves is occurring within a greater climate context. So those things are fairly easy to do, but they're very effective. I don't have an answer to the pressures. I mean, we all work under them, but I think maybe just if you mentally prioritise this as something that you always come back to, sort of a touchstone that you remind yourself, have I, I've got my photos, I've got my news grabs, I've got whatever else I need, but have I thought about whether there's a climate angle to this? Have I made sure that I've spoken to one person about this for the story? It's almost like a muscle that you need to start using to remind yourself. Yeah.
Josh, you're a businessman and a farmer. So often the economics of this issue has been kind of what has forced things along. But again, it's probably not as deep or as meaningful as it could be. Any suggestions there on how to make that more effective, that kind of side of things?
Yeah, I think for me, it's an important part of the narrative. And, when I reflected and shared before about this, the large span of climate events that we've had, What I didn't tell you is that, you know, on the back of drought, which, you know, farming is the lifeblood of our community where I live in Gloucester. It's everything. It's the tractors driving up and down the main road every day, going between farms. It's the connection point. It's the mums and dads that are on the P&C that, you know, also have agricultural businesses that are the lifeblood of our community. And for me, the climate story is really one of loss and heartache for our community, because that's what keeps our community going. That's the fundraising dollars for the local Westpac helicopter and the fundraising dollars for the P&C. All of that contextually means that when we have these severe climate events, that stops or effectively puts a stop on local community being able to fundraise for things that we need. Also, I think it's often overlooked that, you know, things like bushfires actually really badly affect tourism. So where we typically saw a season that would have a boom or a bit of a bounce because we live an hour from the snow, an hour from the beach, and live in this really beautiful spot. They effectively, because of the bushfires, just cancelled all the tourism in our local area. And we know that the impacts of COVID have then rolled that over. And then we have flood events which prevent people from travelling through our area as well. Our farm, our property, we've had to turn to Airbnb to try and, you know, bolster the farm income, because it's simply not enough. And the unpredictable nature of the landscape just means that we can't rely on it as a sole source. But unfortunately, the property is kind of bouncing as well, just as much as what the agricultural enterprise is, because people don't want to travel as much during really severe weather events. So it's that kind of weather dependent and obviously very much climate dependent activity that's keeping, you know, the bouncing economy of, you know, particularly the local level, but also the regional level as well. And that has a drastic impact over time.
One of the things I would like journalists to be able to take away from today is being armed with the kinds of questions and knowledge to be able to really ask things in a meaningful way. Lesley, you talked about, you know, addressing now is not the time, but there's also we don't have the data, and come on, if there's global warming, why have we got record cold temperatures? What's a way that journalists can arm themselves to be able to push back on that effectively?
Well, I think as Miki alluded to, you've got to think ahead. You know, we are seeing the impacts of climate change right now. So it's important to report on climate change as a now problem, not just a hypothetical future problem. But we know from science that even if we were to stop emitting greenhouse gases today, we would still get significant climate change for at least the next 2 or 3 decades, because it's not an instantaneous impact. You know, it's like a big ocean liner that needs to be turned around. And the climate that we've got now is because of the emissions from 3 decades ago. And what we do now affects emissions hence. So I think, you know, acknowledging that climate change impacts are with us now and we can see them all about us, and that they are going to get worse. But how much worse they get depends on action now. So getting people to both look at now and look ahead and think about, you know, what your kids and grandkids are going to have to deal with in the future is really the way of connecting to what people care about.
Miki, how do you deal with the pushback that comes inevitably from the stories that you put out? Are people getting into your timeline on Twitter and pushing false narratives?
Actually, you know what? It doesn't happen anywhere near as much as you might think now. And I think that's actually because there's been a big shift in the last 5 years, unfortunately, because we've had so many, disasters like the bushfires and like extensive flooding, that people really are connecting the dots now. The chickens are coming home to roost, unfortunately, in terms of what the scientists were saying was going to happen is now occurring. And it's interesting, there used to be that this is not the time to talk about it. And we definitely saw that 10 years ago with the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria. I mean, I know someone who worked for an environmental organisation who raised the spectre of climate change at the time and was just, you know, slammed down, shouted down, you know, that would have been, 11 years ago. But, you know, now, for example, with the floods, I really feel like there was a willingness in the public to acknowledge that this was not a 1 in 100 year event. It had happened the month before and the month before that. So I almost feel like that rhetoric has kind of changed quite a lot now. In terms of the kind of kickback I get, I don't actually get that much. I mean, you get the old rusted on or the odd rusted on kind of real climate skeptic, but most people seem to be fairly accepting of the science now, and that's what the polling shows. People believe in climate change and they're really worried about climate change.
Josh, do you get any pushback on the importance of Indigenous contributions in this area?
I think there's probably a bit of pushback in the Indigenous ag side. I don't think farmers traditionally have aligned to Indigenous values. Kind of generally, there's still a lot of work to be done there, and I kind of estimate we're about 40 to 50 years behind the conversation there compared to the US and Canada. I think the ag sector at large, I mean, in 2015, I led the first proactive climate change motion for any major agricultural political organisation within New South Wales. And the impact of that, I think, has led to, I was involved in the development of Australian Farmers for Climate Action and, just actually creating that pathway between farmers and climate scientists. I don't think we're necessarily there between Indigenous people and climate scientists. I think there's a mutual understanding that there's a lot of knowledge to be shared there, but I don't think the yarn has necessarily took place in the way it's needed yet. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. I don't see pushback, but I think there's a lot of opportunities to delve deeper and explore that in a lot more detail.
Great. We do have a couple of questions. So I'm actually going to see whether Helen who's put up a question in the chat. Helen, would you care to actually put your microphone on, maybe your camera on, and put your question to our panel?
Okay. Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, great. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, I just wanted to get a bit of an understanding where you feel that the public is with regards to their understandings of emissions or some of the conversations that we might take for granted, whether or not the readers and the audience are actually needing more background or more explanation, or whether you think they're kind of pretty much with us. So not to be talking down to people, but to be talking to them at the correct level.
So understand their literacy. I'll get you to weigh in on that first, Helen. Thank you so much. Thank you, Helen. I'll get you to weigh in on that first, Lesley.
Sure. Look, I think the level of climate literacy has changed a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. And as Miki alluded to, things in the last 5 years in particular have really picked up. So I think the sheer volume of reporting about climate and climate change has improved literacy. I know on the Climate Council, when we write a report, we kind of aim for, a reasonably well-informed Year 12 student as the sort of the level that we would go for. It is a fine line because, we don't want to talk down to people or assume too much. And once again, as Miki indicated earlier, it's about contextualizing the message that you want to deliver in terms of things that people can relate to, things that are in their local environment, things that are affecting their families or their financial security or what's in the supermarket or whatever. So, you don't have to have an understanding of the million words in an IPCC report to understand that the climate is changing and that is affecting all of us. So I think things have gotten easier in the last 5 to 10 years, definitely.
Miki, your thoughts on the climate literacy of readers, viewers, listeners?
Yeah, it's a really, as a journalist, you're always trying to work out where to pitch things because you don't want to lose people, but you also don't want them feeling like that you're being patronising or perhaps boring them. I usually try and explain technical terms, in brackets or some sort of brief explanation. I usually try and embed previous stories so that if people aren't across, where a debate's gone, they can go and read up on what's happened so far. But I assume that there is a certain level of literacy now, like Lesley was saying. We've been talking about this stuff for a number of years. We're talking about it more and more. And most people have some understanding of things like emissions, climate change, the main drivers of climate change. But I suppose you can't make too many assumptions. Like you don't want to get so lost within your own sector that you just lose your audience. So you're probably better off erring on the side of simplicity rather than complexity, to be honest. Yeah.
Josh, how do you balance that as a communications specialist in this area?
I wouldn't say I'm a specialist, but I think for me it's having the yarn and meeting people where they're at. So I really find comfort. My grandparents, for instance, who have really old traditional Western views around certain things, can engage in the conversation around events fairly easily, and understand that things are changing beyond what is known to them. And I guess I was very fortunate as a kid growing up and having my great-grandmother alive and being able to share that with her around the impacts that she was seeing on the farm, and knowing that there's a point there that no longer can the narrative of cycles and just business as usual that doesn't fly anymore. That there was significant changes and the conversation had to change. And I saw that when I spoke to really old farmers, particularly back 6-7 years ago, when they were struggling to talk about climate change as a concept. They could tell me about the changes in weather patterns. This is their language to me. The changes in weather patterns around rain and the amount of heat, and the impact that was seeing on their cattle. So I think for me, it's important to go and to share that narrative and share the view that people can engage with at that level, while trying to upskill the knowledge of readers or viewers to share that narrative around where they need to head, and that there is this incredibly big scientific rigor around climate data and climate knowledge and science, and that we need to bridge that gap and to really path that narrative around so that people can buy in at a level that suits them.
Thank you. Robert McLean, you've got a question. If you can turn off your microphone, it's lovely to see you on camera.
Thank you. Emotion rather than facts change minds. So we got any comments about that? Mainly from Miki, I suppose. You, as a journalist, you would write about that a lot.
So Miki, how do you kind of make it emotional so that it drags people in, I guess, without being alarmist?
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, you're right. It is people's emotions that really engage them in a story. So that's why, where you can, it's always good to try and personalise things and humanise them and localise them. Finding somebody who could be a case study, who can tell that human story about, for example, how flooding has affected their farm, or, for example, what it feels like to lose somebody because they've suffered a heat-related death, something like that. It's much, people connect with other people. They also connect with animals, but actually I found not as much as people. It really is, you can tell a story about an endangered species and people do engage, but if you could tell the story about the person who's looked after the endangered species and brought it back from the brink, audiences love that sort of person-to-person engagement. Yeah.
Dorothy Henderson is in an area where it may be dropping out, so I'm actually going to read her question and comment. As a farmer and journalist who has studied sustainable development, I have found a real value in Farmers for Climate Action and the Climate Media Centre in terms of climate coverage, access to stories, and also for my own sanity. Do these groups have a value to all sectors of the media in enabling the hearing of messages of people like Annika Molesworth? Miki, is that something that you wanted to might be able to answer?
Yeah, I think that they do. I think most journalists who sort of cover this area from time to time know about the Climate Media Centre or the Climate Council. Someone like Annika Molesworth has got a high profile because she's obviously been interviewed by the ABC and others. I think she's done an Australian story before. So we are aware of them, and I'm really glad that they offer you some sanity and a sense of having access to stories that are relevant to you. But yeah, we do kind of come back to those sources again and again to try and find people who I guess are starting from a viewpoint of insight. People have to have insight into their own experience before they can go and share it with the media.
Josh, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Are you approached by media to find so-called case studies or the like, to somewhat to Robert's story point as well about emotion and connecting it to people? But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on some of these kind of advocacy groups, but also trying to dig into the community and find people with compelling stories to help shape the narrative?
I think community groups, or groups like Farmers for Climate Action, and there's a whole heap of them now. I think that certainly developed in the last few years. I think they're a really good place to turn, and so is the Climate Media Centre. I mean, for me, if you're a journalist, that's where I would instantaneously go around any stories around climate change, and I would try and play the intersection, if I was a journalist, between real life story and the emotion, and then trying to get somebody like Lesley to share really complex data really succinctly and share that narrative and interweave it together. Certainly, I have been involved in quite a bit of media as well, and our story's been shared, both nationally but also internationally through Al Gore's project, and the work that we do on our farm. And I think for me, there's a real balance around what are the multi angles that you might be able to get from a story. So, I often find that the journalists that come to our farm and are able to sit on, in the dirt and meet my parents and hear their stories and even meet my grandparents at times and have a yarn to them and really contextualize the Indigenous agricultural narrative and then the impacts of climate change upon that. Now, I know it's multi-layered, but that for me is the real building blocks of what Australia is today. And as we continue around this pathway of voice and other acknowledgements of Indigenous people within the Constitution and referendums, all of that ties into this bigger picture around how our voice will continuously be needed around climate and environmental events as well. So I'm looking forward for that nexus to continue going forward, because it's such an important part of the jigsaw, and we're better to turn than Indigenous people for the biggest, longest source of knowledge around climate events over the last 65,000 years.
Thank you so much.
Karen, could I just add to that?
Yes, absolutely.
One of the things we've learned about climate change communication is that while the message is important, the messenger is also really, really important. And certainly, and the Climate Media Centre has been mentioned several times, but what we've tried to do with the Climate Media Centre is if you have an agriculture story, they will find you a farmer to comment. Or if you have a health story, they will find you a doctor or a nurse to comment. Or if you've got an emergency services, they'll find you a firefighter to comment. So, delivering, and it comes back to that emotion question as well, delivering the message through a trusted source that has a lived experience of that impact, that really has an impact on people. And the Climate Media Centre and the Climate Council can help you find those spokespeople to deliver that.
Great. We have Elizabeth Redman. Miki, in particular, there's a lot of bad news about climate. Do you have an example of a climate story that really engaged readers?
Hi, Elizabeth. I think I can think of two examples. People love good news stories. So, for example, I did one a little while ago about bandicoots returning to Victoria. There's an area that's been fenced off and had all the predators removed, feral species removed. 30 years after they were last in that area, the species is now returning. And sometimes stuff, I guess, just hits a chord, and that one really did. I think it's because, as I was saying before, you need to leave on your sort of slightly darker content, I guess, with happier stories, even if they're about quite a niche topic like a bandicoot. The other one that I had quite a lot of success with recently was where I did a thing where I tested how much gas, or tested what the emissions were in my kitchen, and then talked about, the sort of finding out first person. And I think the reason that kind of works is that these are the kind of preoccupations we have on a daily basis. It's like, oh God, why is there plastic around the cucumber? Oh my God, is my gas stove, putting out emissions? Should I drive the kids to school in the car? I feel guilty. It's these like little things that interact with your much bigger fears around the future of the earth. And so, it's good as a reporter to try and remember that and to tap into what people care about on a daily basis, and then also perhaps what they care about when they're thinking about who they might vote for or what kind of political action they might take. Yeah.
I was too frightened to do any tests in my kitchen. Thanks, Miki. Jim has a question. Has been waiting patiently.
Thanks, Karen. One of the problems I have with the whole climate change debate is that most of the journalists reporting on climate change, I believe, have very little idea of the basic physics and chemistry and the science behind what people are reporting. And if you do not have a good grounding in science, how can you relate your stories to the general public, who've probably got even less of an understanding of science?
I'm happy to take that one if you want.
Sorry?
Yeah, Miki's going to answer that one, if that's all right.
Right, good. I wonder, for example, how many of those people in on this Zoom meeting have a degree in science? Be interesting to know. I started life as a geologist.
So, Jim, I think I'll answer your question in the spirit that it's given. Journalists can't possibly be experts in everything that they cover. I mean, it's not realistic that you would spend any part of your career on one thing and one thing only. So, you know, I have started a degree in science and then transferred to an arts degree, actually. But, you know, what we do, our job is not to be the expert. It's to go and find the experts and report accurately what they tell us. So we can't all be experts in everything, like in physics or geology or whatever it might be, but we can find the physicists and the geologists and work out how to crunch down what they're telling us into something that is easily understood and accessible to a general audience. That would be my response.
Lesley, did you want to say anything? There's a comment here saying that you delivered a really good course on climate change through UA.
Thanks very much, Dorothy. I'm glad you saw it. Unfortunately, it got very out of date and it was taken down, so don't waste time going and looking for it. Look, I know I keep harping on about the Climate Council, but the Climate Council really does have an enormous amount of information that's written at a very sort of clear and basic level. I think probably, and, you know, maybe my colleague at the council, Jane, is listening to this, you know, perhaps what we should be doing is recording another online course on the basics of climate change for everybody. Maybe that's a project that I might throw myself into at some point. But look, as Miki says, not everybody can be a scientist, you know, and even as a scientist, I'm an ecologist by background, but I actually end up talking about all sorts of aspects of climate change science that I wasn't trained in at university, but I've, you know, had to become informed about because that's one of my roles as a communicator. So I think it does behove everybody to get informed at least a basic level. We're here to help you do that. But I think, as Miki says, it's pretty unfair to expect any scientist, any journalist to be expert at everything, because as I said at the beginning, climate change is a very, very complex issue that affects absolutely everything about our lives. We can't expect to be experts at all of that. So focus on something that you do well.
Thank you, Lesley. Tawa has a question. The built environment is a major carbon emitter and building code standards are a major ideological battleground in Australia, with powerful industry lobby groups pushing against any improvement of those standards. How should property reporters cover this issue to shift the needle? I might go to you, Lesley.
Look, I think journalists have a role in pushing back against any group in our society that is trying to delay the action that we need, whether they're property developers or the mining industry or absolutely anybody. So absolutely push back, get yourself informed about the percentage of emissions that is released into the atmosphere from buildings and infrastructure. And keep up the pressure. That's what we should be doing, not just in the property sector, but in all sectors, be they agriculture, transport, energy production, or everything. You know, I think the media has just an enormous opportunity and responsibility to push back against, you know, it's not so much the denialists anymore, but delay is the new denial, and we've got to push back against that.
Miki, any suggestions? One of the things that we haven't got to yet, and maybe I can kind of move it into this, is partly the funding and motivation of those who were deniers and are now the delayers. Any thoughts on that, on how journalists can, in that particular sector, can report?
Yeah, look, I mean, I was just thinking the energy efficiency, I think they're called the Energy Efficiency Council. I've had a mental blank, but I'm sorry if that's not quite right. But anyway, the council who deal with energy efficiency would be a fantastic place to go to, because they can talk about things like energy efficiency in homes, you know, what the building standard should be, whether 7 stars is enough or should we be going to 9 stars. So I think, you know, when you feel like there are these vested interests that are trying to sort of slow the conversation down or even just stop it, there's always somebody who's been doing fantastic work in the space who you can also offer space to, and you can, you know, give them the platform and let them tell your audience about what else exists out there. And I think we have to be realistic. We live in a capitalist society. There are large corporations making a lot of money out of either profiting off emissions or just delaying the conversation and keeping the status quo as it is. And we have to be realistic about that. Yeah. Josh, any thoughts?
I think it's, you know, agriculture also gets its fair share of, you know, being told it needs to do the work. And I think we're better as an industry for it. So, you know, I look back at the last 7-8 years that I've been involved in these conversations, and I can certainly see by being held accountable not only by the thought leaders and the industry experts in the sector, but also externally. I think that's what drives us as an industry and what makes us question what we're doing, you know, at large, and helps us make decisions around what that process should look like. So that's why we get organisations like Farmers for Climate Action starting with the Meat and Livestock Association, creating targets, all of these, and there's certainly work to be done. I don't think we're out of the woods yet, but it's that accountability back to the general public that we all need. And I think journalists play an important role by asking those pivotal questions to ask what else we can be doing and where we should be focusing our effort as an industry.
Thank you. And there have been some interesting comments in the chat as well. I will just pick up on Jeanette's. And she's talking about how journos can build their knowledge around the topic, as well as reading reports and upskilling. She also makes sure she's got access to a network of scientists, and Jane has then posted some stuff as well. So if you're interested in some of that, there have been some interesting posts within the chat as well that you might want to cut and paste. Thanks for a really great conversation and some really fantastic questions. We are going to run over time, but I'm going to I want to go back to each of our guests to finish up, giving us their top 3 tips on this area, just to kind of round things out. So Lesley, we'll get you to go first.
Sure. I'll reiterate 2 things that I said before and then throw in another one. So don't treat climate change as only an environmental issue. It is an environmental issue, of course, but it's an everything issue, and you can bring climate change into all sorts of reporting. Secondly, go to the Climate Council and all of those other sources that Miki mentioned earlier. We're here to help you report and report better and to have confidence in reporting. And the third one is a plea. I still get asked at the end of an interview, you know, say the Climate Council's released a media release on a particular topic. I'll get rung up by a journalist, and then they'll say at the end of the interview, but what do you say to all of those people that don't believe in climate change? I get cranky now when I get asked that. It's a really lazy question, and I often will come back and say, I'll debate climate change when you're ready to debate gravity, because the science is clear. Let's stop using words like belief, because it's not a religion. Let's stop using words like debate, because there isn't a science debate. Do a bit of homework and don't ask that question, because that notion of false balance just plays into the hands of those who would choose to delay action. Thank you.
Thank you. Miki, your top 3.
Yeah, my top 3 would be to humanise and localise your stories when you can, and to prioritise First Nations voices. Talk about people and beloved landscapes and species that are being affected here and now, because I think that's the way to truly draw people into stories. My second tip would be to fact check, because climate emission science is confusing and overwhelming, but you know, there's always somebody you can go and ask, and people don't mind being asked those questions, as in experts. And yeah, where possible, include some climate context in every story that you write where appropriate. It doesn't have to be very much. It could just be a sentence or 2.
Brilliant. Josh?
Thanks, Karen. I think my 3, I might have touched on a few throughout the yarn today, but effectively, I think keep in mind that there's a bigger story at play. This isn't just one event. It's just not a one-off. This is a series of events and activities, and that creates a huge impact across regional and rural communities. The second one is I think a bit of a plea to the media as well, to actually come out and see our places and and really get your hands dirty and create long-lasting relationships with us. Don't just ring us up out of the blue and say, hey, I know a flood's just gone through your property, can you have a yard? You know, actually show some empathy, come and build the relationships and the connections with us, and then we can go from that basis. And I think there's a lot of trauma that happens when those events really immediately take place, and show empathy through that. It's so important. And the last one for me is, you know, as a fair-skinned, you know, suit and tie wearing farmer at times, and Black Indigenous farmer at times, I'm also trying to change the narrative around what we look like as Indigenous people and also as farmers. I'm happy to don the Kuba and wear an Aboriginal flag on the shirt, but we're going through this process to transform what modern identity looks like for us as Aboriginal people and also for farmers. And I really respect journalists that see that and want to share that narrative in a proactive light. So where you want to share our stories around this, don't just rock up and expect us to be donning in the Kuba and some R.M. Williams boots. There's a lot more to the picture, and we've often, as you know, individual spokesperson, have thought about what kind of vision and image we want to portray through this story as well.
Thank you. That's some really great advice and tips and tricks from all of you. And we will actually be sending around a wrap-up of this evening's event, including these fantastic suggestions. So thank you to our three speakers, a round of applause to them. Proceeds of tonight's event are going to the Media Safety and Solidarity Fund, which is run by MIA and assists our colleagues in the Asia Pacific region, particularly those in emergency situations. And more, that does mean climate-related disasters. So please, if you haven't made a donation to the MSSF, we would love it if you did. We are actually going to put up a slide any moment now. And so do also keep an eye out for our second webinar on this topic later in the year, where we will address disinformation, misinformation in climate change reporting. And we're also working towards some reporting guidelines. So please do watch this space. So if you go to the MIA website, you'll be able to find the MSSF donation site, and then the Climate Council website also has lots of terrific resources. So we are working on trying to ensure that there's as much out there for you as possible. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you all to your interest. Keep an eye on our YouTube channel and our socials where you'll see this posted as well. And good night, farewell, have a great night.